A millionaire's cruel words to a waitress backfired in the most unexpected way, revealing a truth that changed everything and left an entire restaurant speechless. The crystal chandeliers of Belmont Grand Restaurant cast dancing shadows across marble floors as another evening of excess began. This wasn't just any restaurant. It was where power brokers made deals that moved millions, where influence was traded like currency, and where being seen at the right table meant everything in this city's ruthless social hierarchy. Joe Blackwood adjusted his platinum watch, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. At the pinnacle of his success, he commanded a business empire worth hundreds of millions. Yet tonight felt different. The weight of recent boardroom victories should have filled him with satisfaction, but instead, an inexplicable emptiness gnawed at his chest. "Sir, your usual table is prepared," the maitre d' announced with practiced deference, recognizing the man whose charitable donations had funded the restaurant's recent renovation. What the staff didn't know was that those donations were mere tax write-offs, calculated moves in a game Joe had mastered long ago. The dining room buzzed with the quiet intensity of wealth and ambition. At corner tables, tech moguls whispered about acquisitions that would reshape industries. Near the windows, political figures shared hushed conversations that would influence policy. This was Joe's world, a place where money spoke louder than conscience, where results mattered more than methods. As he settled into his reserved corner booth, Joe noticed the subtle changes in atmosphere his presence always created. Conversations became more measured, laughter more calculated. Even here, among his peers, he remained isolated by the very success that defined him. The evening began routinely enough. The sommelier presented wine selections with reverent detail, each bottle worth more than most people earned in a month. Joe barely listened, his mind already racing through tomorrow's meetings, next week's acquisitions, next month's expansion plans. Time was money, and every moment not spent growing his empire felt like failure. Then she appeared. The new waitress moved with quiet efficiency, her presence somehow different from the usual staff. Where others approached his table with nervous anticipation of generous tips, she carried herself with understated dignity. Her name tag read, Eleanor, and unlike the others who stumbled over elaborate descriptions of dishes they'd never afford to taste, she spoke with genuine knowledge about the menu. "Good evening," Elena said simply, placing the water glass with steady hands. "Have you decided on your selection this evening?" Joe barely glanced up from his phone, where stock prices demanded his immediate attention. "The usual. Tell the kitchen to hurry. I have calls to make." What he missed in his distraction was the flicker of recognition in Elena's eyes, followed by something that might have been disappointment. She'd heard about Joe Blackwood, of course. Everyone in the service industry had stories about the tech magnate who treated staff like furniture, expensive to maintain but rarely worth acknowledging. As the evening progressed, Joe's mood darkened with each phone call. A merger he'd orchestrated was facing unexpected regulatory scrutiny. Competitors were encroaching on markets he'd considered secure. The foundation of his carefully constructed empire felt less stable than it had that morning, and the feeling of losing control made his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "Sir, your appetizer," Elena announced, setting down a plate with the same careful attention she'd shown earlier. This time, Joe looked up, and what he saw irritated him immediately. Unlike the other servers who moved with hurried deference, Elena carried herself with quiet confidence. She didn't fidget under his gaze or rush through rehearsed pleasantries. Instead, she waited patiently for any additional requests, her composure somehow challenging the authority he'd grown accustomed to wielding without question. "This isn't what I ordered," Joe snapped, though he hadn't actually looked at the dish. The lie came easily, a test of power, a reminder of the hierarchy that governed his world. Elena examined the plate carefully before responding. "I believe this is the pan-seared scallops with truffle reduction that you requested, sir. Would you prefer something different this evening?" Her calm professionalism should have diffused the situation, but Joe felt his irritation spike. In boardrooms, his displeasure sent executives scrambling. Here was someone treating his complaint as a simple misunderstanding rather than a crisis requiring immediate resolution. The other diners began to notice the tension at Joe's table. Conversations quieted as attention shifted toward the unfolding drama. This was the kind of scene that would fuel gossip for weeks. Joe Blackwood publicly confronting service staff. Some watched with anticipation, others with discomfort, but none looked away. "Don't tell me what I ordered." Joe's voice carried across the dining room, causing several nearby tables to pause their conversations entirely. "I've been coming here longer than you've probably been working anywhere." Elena remained perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that somehow conveyed both respect and strength. "Of course, sir. I apologize for any confusion. What would you prefer this evening?" The apology should have satisfied him, but instead, Joe felt his anger intensify. There was something in Elena's tone, not defiance exactly, but an absence of the fear he expected. She wasn't cowering or begging forgiveness. She was simply professional. Around them, the restaurant had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. Other staff members watched nervously from their stations, recognizing the signs of an escalating situation. The maitre d' began moving toward the table, but Elena subtly shook her head, a gesture that said she could handle whatever was coming. Joe's next words would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. In his frustration and need to re-establish dominance, he was about to make a choice that would reveal truths he'd spent years avoiding, set in motion events that would reshape his understanding of success, and introduce him to a strength he'd never encountered in boardrooms or balance sheets. The golden cage of his privilege was about to be unlocked by someone he'd dismissed as insignificant, and the door, once opened, could never be closed again. The tension in Belmont Grand Restaurant had reached a crescendo that made even the most seasoned diners uncomfortable. Joe Blackwood's voice carried across the elegant dining room like thunder before a storm, each word calculated to establish dominance in a game where he'd never learned to lose gracefully. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Joe demanded, his question hanging in the air like a challenge. The irony was lost on him. A man so consumed with his own importance that he assumed everyone should recognize his face, his name, his power. Elena remained perfectly composed, her posture straight but not rigid, her expression attentive but unafraid. "You're a customer who deserves excellent service, sir. That's all that matters to me this evening." Her response hit Joe like cold water. In boardrooms, his reputation preceded him like a weapon. Competitors knew his name before they knew his face. Politicians returned his calls within minutes. Here stood someone treating him not as Joe Blackwood, the titan of industry, but simply as another person sitting at a table. The other servers had begun gathering near the kitchen entrance, whispering among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. This wasn't ordinary dinner theater. This was Joe Blackwood, whose charitable donations had funded the restaurant's expansion, whose presence attracted other wealthy patrons whose displeasure could affect their livelihoods. "I could have you fired with a single phone call," Joe continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier outburst. "I could have this entire place shut down by morning. Do you understand the position you're in?" Elena's response came without hesitation, spoken with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout the evening. "I understand that you're upset, sir. I'd like to help resolve whatever has made your dining experience unsatisfactory." The simplicity of her reply exposed something Joe hadn't expected. His threats, which had moved mountains in business negotiations, seemed to bounce off her like raindrops on stone. She wasn't dismissing his power. She was simply refusing to be intimidated by it. At nearby tables, other patrons had stopped pretending to focus on their own meals. The dining room had transformed into an impromptu theater, with Joe and Elena as unwilling performers in a drama that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Some diners looked uncomfortable, others intrigued, but all were watching. Joe felt something he rarely experienced, a complete loss of control over a situation. In his world, problems were solved with money, influence, or carefully applied pressure. Here was someone who seemed immune to all three, and the realization made his chest tighten with a mixture of rage and something that might have been panic. "You're clearly new here," Joe said, his tone shifting to patronizing condescension. "Let me explain how this works. I speak, you listen. I order, you serve. I complain, you apologize and fix it. This isn't complicated." Elena nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words carefully. "I understand your expectations, sir. However, I believe there might be a misunderstanding about what happened this evening." "There's no misunderstanding," Joe snapped. "You brought me the wrong order, then had the audacity to argue about it. Actually, sir, if I may, Elena's voice remained steady, but there was something new in her tone. Not defiance, but clarity. I brought you exactly what you ordered. The pan-seared scallops with truffle reduction. The same dish you've ordered on your last 7 visits to this restaurant. The words landed like physical blows. Joe felt his face flush as the implication became clear. Not only had Elena been paying attention to his orders, but she'd been counting his visits, studying his patterns. The idea that a waitress had been observing him closely enough to memorize his dining habits made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way that business rivals had never achieved. "That's impossible," Joe said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I've been coming here for years. I know what I order." Elena reached into her apron and produced a small notepad, the kind servers use to track orders. With practiced efficiency, she flipped through several pages before finding what she was looking for. "Would you like me to read your previous orders from this week, sir?" The offer hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Joe realized that Elena had documentation, proof of his dining patterns that would either vindicate her or expose his lie. The calculation that had served him so well in business now worked against him. He could see the odds shifting, the power balance tilting away from his favor. "I don't need to hear anything from you," Joe said, but his bluster was beginning to sound hollow even to his own ears. "Just bring me what I actually ordered and stop wasting my time." "Of course, sir," Elena replied, closing her notepad with a soft snap. "What would you like me to bring you instead?" The question was a masterpiece of professional courtesy that nonetheless felt like a trap. Joe realized he couldn't remember what he'd actually intended to order, if anything different from his usual selection. The evening's stress, the phone calls, the mounting pressure from various business challenges had left his mind scattered, unfocused. "Just surprise me," Joe muttered, hating how weak the words sounded as they left his mouth. Elena nodded once, a crisp, professional acknowledgement. "I'll speak with the chef about preparing something special for you this evening, sir. I'll also make sure to note your preferences for future visits." As she turned to leave, Joe felt a surge of desperate need to regain control of the situation. "Wait!" he called out, his voice carrying further than intended across the now silent dining room. Elena stopped and turned back to him, her expression patient and attentive. Around them, the restaurant held its collective breath, sensing that whatever came next would determine how this unprecedented confrontation would end. Joe found himself staring into Elena's eyes, really looking at her for the first time all evening. What he saw there wasn't fear, resentment, or even annoyance. Instead, he glimpsed something that shook him more than any hostile takeover or boardroom betrayal ever had. Pity. She felt sorry for him. The realization hit Joe like a physical blow. This woman, whom he'd been trying to intimidate and humiliate, was looking at him with the same expression he'd seen on the faces of social workers visiting homeless shelters he'd photographed himself donating to for tax purposes. She saw him not as powerful or feared, but as someone to be pitied. "Never mind," Joe said quietly, his voice barely audible even to himself. Elena nodded once more and walked toward the kitchen, her steps measured and professional. Behind her, she left a dining room full of confused patrons and one very shaken billionaire who was beginning to suspect that his understanding of power, respect, and human nature might be fundamentally flawed. The golden cage was starting to feel more like a prison, and the key was in the hands of someone he'd tried to crush. The kitchen door swung open with deliberate precision as Elena emerged, carrying not just a replacement dish, but an air of quiet determination that seemed to charge the atmosphere around her. The entire dining room had transformed into an amphitheater of anticipation, where conversations had died to whispers and cutlery clinked nervously against fine china. Joe watched her approach, still reeling from the moment when he'd recognized pity in her eyes. That look had shattered something fundamental in his self-perception, a carefully constructed image of himself as commanding, respected, feared. In boardrooms across the city, grown executives trembled when he entered. Here was someone who saw through all of that to something he'd hoped no one would ever notice, the emptiness beneath the empire. "Your special selection this evening," Elena announced, placing the artfully arranged plate before him with the same steady grace she'd maintained throughout their confrontation. Chef Harrison prepared his signature lamb with rosemary reduction, paired with seasonal vegetables sourced locally from Millbrook Farms. The irony wasn't lost on Joe. He was being served by someone who clearly knew more about the restaurant's offerings than he did, despite his years of patronage. Elena had just demonstrated knowledge of the chef's name, the dish's preparation, even the source of ingredients, while he couldn't remember what he'd originally intended to order. At the table directly behind Joe, Isabella Thornton, the city's most influential social columnist, leaned forward with predatory interest. Her weekly dining reviews could make or break establishments throughout the metropolitan area, and she'd witnessed the entire exchange with the keen eye of someone who recognized newsworthy drama when she saw it. "This is fascinating," Isabella whispered to her dinner companion, loud enough for nearby tables to overhear. Joe Blackwood being schooled in customer service by his own waitress. "My readers will find this absolutely delicious." The comment reached Joe's ears like a physical slap. Isabella Thornton's column appeared in 3 major newspapers and reached hundreds of thousands of readers weekly. A negative review from her could damage reputations that had taken decades to build, and she'd just witnessed him being publicly outmaneuvered by restaurant staff. Elena, however, seemed completely unaware of the social dynamics swirling around her. She remained focused entirely on Joe, treating him not as a public spectacle but as a person deserving of professional service, regardless of his behavior. "Is there anything else I can bring you this evening, sir?" Elena asked, her tone carrying the same genuine attentiveness she'd shown from the beginning. Joe stared at the plate before him, his appetite completely evaporated. The food looked exquisite. Chef Harrison was renowned for his culinary artistry, but eating felt impossible when his throat seemed constricted by a growing sense of exposure and vulnerability. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" Joe asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could consider its implications. The dining room's ambient noise seemed to pause as nearby tables strained to hear Elena's response. This wasn't the usual power play they'd witnessed earlier. This was something raw, more desperate. Elena considered the question with the same thoughtful attention she'd given his dinner order. "Should I be afraid of you, sir?" "Most people are," Joe admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "I control companies that employ thousands. I make decisions that affect entire industries. When I speak, markets move." "That's certainly impressive," Elena replied, and there was no sarcasm in her tone, just genuine acknowledgement. "But none of that changes the fact that you're sitting in a restaurant asking for dinner service. Here, you're simply a customer." Her words cut deeper than any hostile takeover or boardroom betrayal Joe had ever experienced. She was describing him as ordinary, removing all the external validations that had defined his identity for decades. Without his wealth, his influence, his reputation, what was he? The answer terrified him. "You don't understand," Joe said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've worked for everything I have. I've sacrificed relationships, health, sleep, everything to build what I've built. People respect what I've accomplished." Elena nodded slowly, and for the first time that evening, her professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something that looked like genuine sadness. "Respect and fear aren't the same thing, sir." The observation hit Joe like lightning illuminating a landscape he'd never truly seen. He thought about his interactions over the past week. Board meetings where executives agreed with him instantly. Social gatherings where conversations stopped when he approached. Charity events where organizers thanked him effusively for donations he'd made primarily for tax benefits. When was the last time someone had genuinely disagreed with him? When had anyone challenged his ideas, questioned his decisions, or treated him as anything other than a walking symbol of success? "I need to make a call," Joe announced abruptly, reaching for his phone with trembling fingers. "Of course, sir," Elena replied. "I'll check on you shortly." As she moved to attend other tables, Joe scrolled through his contacts, looking for someone, anyone, he could call who would ground him, remind him of his importance, validate his worldview. The list was extensive: CEOs, politicians, board members, investors. But as he reviewed each name, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every relationship was transactional. Every conversation revolved around business. Every connection served a specific purpose in maintaining or expanding his empire. Where were his friends? His confidants? The people who knew Joe Blackwood, the person, rather than Joe Blackwood, the billionaire? The realization that such people didn't exist struck him with devastating clarity. Across the dining room, Elena continued serving other tables with the same professional grace she'd shown him. Joe watched her interact with different customers, an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, a young family with restless children, a group of business associates clearly less wealthy than his usual circle. With each table, Elena demonstrated the same attentiveness, the same respect, the same genuine desire to provide excellent service. She wasn't treating Joe poorly. She was treating everyone equally well. The revolutionary concept that his money didn't entitle him to superior humanity was foreign to everything he'd built his life around. "Joe?" A familiar voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Thomas Crawford, his longtime business attorney, and the closest thing he had to a friend, approached the table with concerned expression. Thomas had been dining with clients at the restaurant's private room and had noticed the unusual commotion in the main dining area. "Thomas," Joe said, surprised by how relieved he felt to see a familiar face. "Sit down. I need to ask you something." Thomas settled into the opposite chair, immediately sensing the unusual tension radiating from his client and longtime acquaintance. "Is everything all right? You look unsettled." "Am I a good person, Thomas?" Joe asked, the question emerging with desperate urgency. Thomas blinked, clearly unprepared for such a direct inquiry about character rather than business. That's an unusual question, Joe. Why are you asking? Just answer me, honestly. As someone who's known me for 15 years, am I a good person?" The pause that followed was longer than Joe had hoped, and more telling than any words could have been. "You're successful," Thomas said carefully. "You're brilliant with business. You're generous with charitable donations." "That's not what I asked," Joe interrupted. "I asked if I'm a good person." Thomas glanced around the dining room, noting the continued attention their conversation was drawing, before leaning closer to speak quietly. "Joe, you're asking me to evaluate your character in a public restaurant. This doesn't seem like the appropriate venue. Answer me." The desperate edge in Joe's voice made Thomas uncomfortable. "You're driven, focused. You achieve results. But good? Joe, when was the last time you asked how my family was doing? When did you last remember my wife's name without checking your assistant's notes?" The truth landed like a physical blow. Joe realized he couldn't answer either question. The mirror Elena had held up to him was beginning to show reflections he'd spent decades avoiding, and what he saw there would change everything that came next. Thomas Crawford's uncomfortable silence stretched between them like a chasm, each passing second confirming what Joe had begun to suspect about himself. The attorney's inability to immediately affirm his character spoke volumes that no boardroom presentation ever could. Around them, the restaurant continued its evening rhythm, but their corner table had become an island of devastating self-discovery. "I see," Joe said quietly, his voice carrying a hollowness that Thomas had never heard before. 15 years of professional relationship, and you can't tell me I'm a good person." "Joe, it's not that simple," Thomas began, but Joe raised his hand to stop him. "Actually, it is that simple. Either I treat people with basic human decency or I don't. Either I care about others beyond what they can do for me, or I don't." Joe's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. "And we both know which category I fall into." Elena approached their table with water refills, moving with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her entire evening. She could sense the heavy atmosphere but maintained her professional demeanor, treating this as simply another aspect of service rather than the emotional breakdown it clearly represented. "Is everything satisfactory with your meal, sir?" Elena asked, noting that Joe's expensive dish remained largely untouched. Joe looked up at her, and for the first time that evening, really saw her. Not as an obstacle to his authority or a challenge to his status, but as a human being doing her job with remarkable dignity despite his earlier behavior. "Elena," Joe said, surprising both her and Thomas by using her name. "May I ask you something personal?" Elena hesitated for a moment. Personal questions from customers rarely led anywhere appropriate, but something in Joe's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than inappropriate interest. "Of course, sir. What do you see when you look at me?" The question was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that several nearby diners stopped their conversations to listen. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that his client was venturing into territory that could prove professionally embarrassing. Eleanor considered the question with the same thoughtful attention she'd given everything else that evening. "I see someone who's forgotten that money can't buy the things that matter most." The answer hit Joe like cold water. It wasn't cruel, wasn't designed to humiliate, but it cut through every defense he'd constructed around his identity. "And what matters most?" Joe asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Connection. Purpose beyond yourself. The ability to make others feel valued rather than small." Elena paused, glancing around the dining room where other patrons were openly watching their exchange. "Respect that's earned through character, not fear." Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." "No," Joe interrupted firmly. "I want to hear this. Elena, you've been watching me tonight, taking notes, paying attention to patterns. What else have you observed?" Elena glanced at Thomas, then back at Joe, clearly weighing whether honesty would be welcome or harmful. "You want an honest answer, sir? I'm begging for one." "You're the loneliest person I've served tonight," Elena said simply. "Surrounded by wealth, influence, and fear, but completely isolated from genuine human connection." The observation was delivered without malice, almost clinically, which somehow made it more devastating than any angry accusation could have been. Joe felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, but something deeper, the carefully constructed wall between his public success and private emptiness. At the table behind them, Isabella Thornton leaned forward, her columnist instincts recognizing a story that transcended mere restaurant drama. This was a public moment of reckoning that her readers would find compelling, regardless of their economic status. "You're right," Joe admitted, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "I can't remember the last time someone told me the truth about myself. Everyone around me either wants something or fears me too much, to be honest." "That's not entirely their fault, sir," Elena observed gently. "People respond to the energy you project. If you approach others as transactions rather than relationships, they'll treat you the same way." Thomas watched this exchange with growing alarm. His client was having what appeared to be a breakdown in one of the city's most visible restaurants, in front of influential witnesses, with a waitress serving as an impromptu therapist. "Joe," Thomas said urgently, "perhaps we should—" "Thomas, tell me honestly," Joe interrupted, turning to face his longtime associate. "In all our years working together, have I ever asked about your daughter's college graduation? Your wife's surgery last year? Your mother's funeral?" Thomas's face flushed as the questions hit their mark. "You've been very busy with business matters. That's not an answer. Have I ever shown interest in your life beyond what serves my business needs?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Joe turned back to Elena, who had remained standing throughout this painful examination of his character. "You said I'd forgotten that money can't buy what matters most. When did I know that? When did I lose sight of it?" Elena's expression softened slightly, showing the first crack in her professional composure. "I think most people know it as children, sir. Before the world teaches them to measure worth in different ways. I had a sister," Joe said suddenly, the memory surfacing unbidden. "Claire. She used to say that being rich meant having enough to share, not enough to hoard. She died in a car accident when I was 25, just as my first company was taking off." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. In 15 years, Joe had never mentioned having a sister. "After the funeral, I threw myself into work. Building the business became everything because it was the only thing that didn't hurt to think about. Somewhere along the way, success became more important than purpose. Winning became more important than connecting." Elena listened with genuine attention, not the polite patience of someone paid to endure customer complaints, but the focused presence of someone who understood that she was witnessing something significant. "Claire would have liked you," Joe continued, looking directly at Elena. "She would have appreciated your dignity, your refusal to be intimidated, your ability to see people clearly." "She sounds like she was a wonderful person," Elena replied softly. "She was everything I'm not. Kind, generous with her time, genuinely interested in others. She volunteered at literacy programs, mentored at-risk youth, made everyone around her feel valuable." Joe's voice cracked slightly. "I've spent 20 years building monuments to my own success, while forgetting everything she tried to teach me about what success actually means." The The dining room had fallen into complete silence, drawn into this unexpected moment of vulnerability from one of the city's most powerful figures. Even the kitchen staff had begun gathering near the service windows, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. "It's not too late, sir," Elena said quietly. "People can change if they truly want to." Joe looked around the restaurant, seeing clearly for the first time the audience his breakdown had attracted. Rather than feeling embarrassed, he felt something approaching relief. The mask he'd worn for decades was finally slipping away, and beneath it, perhaps, was someone his sister might have been proud to know. "You're right," Joe said, standing slowly from his chair. "People can change, and I think it's time I started." What happened next would shock everyone in the restaurant and set in motion events that no one could have predicted. Joe stood slowly, his movement causing a ripple of attention throughout the dining room. Every conversation had ceased. Every fork had been set down. Every eye was fixed on the unfolding drama at table 12. What began as a routine evening at Belmont Grand had transformed into something none of the witnesses would ever forget. "Elena," Joe said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed restaurant, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond tonight's behavior." Elena remained perfectly still, her professional training warring with genuine curiosity about where this unprecedented moment was leading. In years of service industry work, she'd never witnessed a customer's complete emotional transformation, especially not someone of Joe Blackwood's stature. "Sir, there's no need," Elena began, but Joe gently raised his hand. "Please, let me finish." Joe turned to address not just Elena, but the entire dining room that had become an unwilling audience to his breakdown and potential redemption. "I've spent the evening treating you with disrespect, making demands based on my wealth rather than my character, assuming my money entitled me to diminish your dignity." Thomas Crawford looked mortified, recognizing that his client was creating a public spectacle that would likely appear in tomorrow's social columns. But something in Joe's demeanor suggested this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a deliberate choice to confront his own behavior publicly. "But more than that," Joe continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I realize I've been living my entire adult life as someone my sister would be ashamed to know. I've used wealth as a weapon, success as a barrier between myself and genuine human connection, influence as a substitute for integrity." Isabella Thornton had stopped pretending to dine and was now openly taking notes, recognizing that she was witnessing either a brilliant public relations maneuver or a genuine moment of transformation. Either way, her readers would find it compelling. Elena's composure finally cracked slightly, revealing surprise at the direction this evening had taken. "Mr. Blackwood, I think perhaps—" "You were right about everything," Joe interrupted, using her formal address for the first time. "About respect versus fear. About connection being more valuable than control. About my loneliness despite all my success. You saw through every defense I've built in 20 years of business." The kitchen staff had abandoned any pretense of continuing their work, gathering at the service windows to witness what their colleague Elena had somehow accomplished, bringing one of the city's most powerful men to a moment of complete honesty about his character. "But there's something you don't know about me," Joe said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone that nonetheless carried throughout the silent dining room. "Something that might explain why your words tonight hit me so deeply." Elena waited, her professional mask completely forgotten now, replaced by genuine human curiosity. "My sister Claire didn't just volunteer at literacy programs," Joe continued. "She specifically worked with adult learners, people who'd never had educational opportunities, immigrants learning English, workers trying to improve their skills for better employment." A flicker of recognition crossed Elena's features, but she remained silent. "She used to tell me stories about her students, their determination, their gratitude, their dignity, despite economic hardships. She said the most rewarding part wasn't teaching them to read, but learning from their resilience, their ability to maintain hope despite circumstances beyond their control." Joe paused, studying Elena's face carefully. "She would have recognized something in you immediately. The same quality she admired in her students, the refusal to let difficult circumstances diminish your sense of self-worth." Elena's professional composure finally cracked completely. "Mr. Blackwood, You're not just a waitress, are you, Elena?" Joe asked gently. "This isn't your career choice. This is a stepping stone, a way to support yourself while pursuing something else. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena looked around the dining room, aware that her answer would be heard by dozens of people, including influential figures who could affect her future in ways she couldn't predict. "I'm completing my master's degree in social work," Elena admitted quietly. "I work here evenings and weekends to pay for school. My thesis focuses on dignity preservation in service interactions, how economic disparity affects human relationships." The revelation sent a murmur through the dining room. Several diners exchanged glances, realizing they'd been witnessing not just a customer service interaction, but a real-time demonstration of Elena's academic research. Joe felt his breath catch. "You've been studying people like me." "I've been studying interactions like this one," Elena corrected. "How power dynamics affect basic human courtesy, how wealth can create barriers to authentic connection, how service workers maintain dignity despite challenging circumstances." Thomas leaned forward, finally understanding why this evening had felt different from typical customer complaints. "You've been conducting research." "Not intentionally," Elena said quickly. "I would never use customers as unwilling research subjects, but tonight's interaction certainly reinforced many of my thesis conclusions about how economic privilege can disconnect people from basic empathy." Joe laughed, not with humor but with the bitter recognition of irony. "So I've been the perfect case study. The wealthy businessman so disconnected from humanity that he can't recognize it in others." "You're not disconnected," Elena said, surprising everyone with her gentle correction. "You're afraid. Afraid that without your wealth and status, no one would value you. Afraid that connection requires vulnerability you can't afford in your business world. Afraid that caring about others might make you appear weak." The psychological insight hit Joe with devastating accuracy. In a few sentences, Elena had diagnosed the emotional wounds he'd spent decades hiding behind professional success. "My sister tried to tell me the same thing," Joe admitted. "Before she died, she warned me that I was building walls instead of bridges, that success without connection was just expensive loneliness." Elena nodded sympathetically. "People in positions of power often struggle with authentic relationships because they're never sure if others care about them or their resources." "So how do I change?" Joe asked, the question emerging with desperate urgency. "How do I become someone worthy of genuine respect rather than fearful compliance?" Elena glanced around the dining room, acutely aware that her answer would be heard by influential people who could remember her words for years to come. "You start by recognizing that every person you encounter, regardless of their job, their education, their economic status, deserves the same courtesy you'd want for yourself. You use your privilege to lift others rather than diminish them. You measure success by how many people you help rather than how much you accumulate." Joe nodded slowly, processing advice that was both simple and revolutionary for someone who'd spent decades viewing life as a zero-sum competition. "And," Elena added quietly, "you honor your sister's memory by becoming the person she believed you could be." The words hit Joe like lightning, illuminating a path forward he'd never considered. Around them, the restaurant remained suspended in unprecedented silence, witnessing a transformation that would change more than just one man's evening. The silence in Belmont Grand Restaurant had become so profound that the distant sounds of kitchen activity seemed amplified. The gentle clinking of plates, the soft hiss of sautéing vegetables, the muted conversations of staff members who had abandoned their duties to witness this unprecedented transformation unfolding in their dining room. Joe stood motionless for a long moment, processing Elena's words about honoring his sister's memory. The weight of 20 years of accumulated guilt, missed opportunities for genuine connection, and the deliberate construction of emotional barriers felt suddenly unbearable. Around him, the restaurant's elegant atmosphere, crystal chandeliers, pristine white tablecloths, carefully arranged flowers, seemed to mock the emptiness he'd only just begun to acknowledge. "Elena," Joe said finally, his voice carrying a quality that none of the witnesses had heard before. Vulnerability without defensiveness, strength without arrogance. "You mentioned that your thesis focuses on dignity preservation in service interactions. I have a question that might sound strange." Elena waited, her academic curiosity clearly engaged, despite the unusual circumstances of this impromptu consultation. Is it possible for someone to learn dignity? Not just to display it temporarily for public relations purposes, but to genuinely develop it as a core characteristic? Joe paused, glancing around the dining room at the faces, watching his every word. I'm asking because I realize I've spent decades confusing dominance with leadership, intimidation with influence, compliance with respect. Thomas Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing that his client was venturing into territory that could fundamentally alter their professional relationship. The Joe Blackwood he'd known for 15 years was pragmatic, calculating, focused entirely on results rather than methods. This version, questioning his own character in front of strangers, was completely unfamiliar. Elena considered the question with the same thoughtful attention she'd given everything else that evening. In my research, I've found that dignity isn't something you acquire or lose based on circumstances. It's something you recognize, in yourself and others. The question isn't whether you can learn it, but whether you can remember it. Remember it? Joe asked. Children naturally treat others with curiosity rather than judgment, acceptance rather than fear. They haven't yet learned to measure worth by external factors. Elena's voice took on the tone of someone passionate about their subject matter. Most people start with dignity and gradually lose sight of it as society teaches them to create hierarchies, to compete rather than collaborate, to view interactions as transactions rather than connections. Isabella Thornton leaned forward from her nearby table, no longer pretending to maintain journalistic objectivity. As someone who'd spent years chronicling the social dynamics of the city's elite, she'd never witnessed such a public examination of privilege and its psychological costs. So you're suggesting, Joe said slowly, that becoming a better person isn't about acquiring new traits, but about removing the barriers I've built around traits I already possess. Exactly, Elena confirmed. Your capacity for empathy, generosity, and genuine connection hasn't disappeared. It's been buried under years of protecting yourself from vulnerability, from the possibility that others might value you for something other than your achievements. Joe felt something shift in his chest. Not the breaking sensation he'd experienced earlier, but something more like awakening. My sister used to say something similar. She'd tell me that business success was just one dimension of human existence, and that focusing exclusively on it was like trying to paint a portrait using only one color. Your sister sounds like she understood something fundamental about human nature, Elena observed. She did. And I've spent 20 years proving her right by becoming exactly the kind of person she worried I might become. Joe turned to address Thomas directly. Thomas, in all our years working together, have I ever asked what you actually wanted from life? Not professionally, but personally? Have I ever inquired about your dreams, your fears, your hopes for your family? Thomas struggled to find an appropriate response. Joe, we've maintained a professional relationship. That's not an answer. It's an evasion. Joe's tone wasn't accusatory, but it was unflinchingly direct. I've treated you like a sophisticated tool rather than a human being with his own complex inner life. I've reduced our relationship to its utility for my business objectives. The truth of this assessment was written clearly on Thomas's face. Their 15-year association had consisted entirely of legal strategy sessions, contract negotiations, and crisis management. Joe had never inquired about Thomas's daughter's college experience, his wife's art therapy practice, or his own frustrated ambitions to write historical fiction. I want to change that, Joe announced, his declaration carrying across the dining room with startling clarity. Not just with Thomas, but with everyone. I want to learn how to see people as complete human beings rather than functions in my business operations. Elena watched this unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing their theoretical research manifest in real-time application. That's a significant commitment, Mr. Blackwood. Genuine change requires consistent effort, not just momentary revelation. I understand that, Joe replied, which is why I want to ask you something that might sound presumptuous, given how I've treated you this evening. Elena waited, clearly uncertain about where this was leading. Would you consider helping me? Not as a customer service representative, but as someone who understands dignity, who's studied these dynamics, who might be willing to teach someone who's forgotten how to treat others with basic human courtesy. The request sent a ripple of surprise through the dining room. Several diners exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. one of the city's most powerful figures, asking for help from someone he'd attempted to humiliate just hours earlier. Elena's professional composure returned as she processed this unexpected proposal. "What exactly are you asking, Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to serve as a consultant, properly compensated, of course, to help me understand how to interact with others in ways that preserve their dignity and mine. I'm asking if you'd help me become someone my sister would have been proud to know." Thomas looked alarmed. "Joe, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," Joe interrupted firmly. "I've spent 20 years hiding my decisions behind closed doors, surrounding myself with people who tell me what they think I want to hear. This conversation needs to happen here, in front of witnesses, so there's accountability for whatever commitment I make." Elena studied Joe's face carefully, clearly evaluating whether this request represented genuine desire for change or simply another form of manipulation. "Mr. Blackwood, transformation isn't something that can be purchased or delegated. It requires personal commitment to uncomfortable self-examination." "I understand that," Joe replied. "I'm not asking you to change me. I'm asking you to help me understand what change looks like, to provide guidance when I inevitably fall back into old patterns, to remind me of the person I'm trying to become when the pressure of business makes me forget." The dining room had become completely silent, every patron recognizing that they were witnessing a moment of potential transformation that transcended typical entertainment. This wasn't just about one man's personal growth. It was about the possibility that wealth and power could be wielded with wisdom rather than arrogance. "There would be conditions," Elena said finally. "Name them." "First, this isn't about improving your public image or managing public relations. Any guidance I provide would be focused on genuine personal development, regardless of how it affects your business reputation." "Agreed." "Second, you would need to commit to regular self-reflection, to examining your motivations and reactions honestly, even when that examination is uncomfortable." "Agreed." "Third, any changes you make would need to extend beyond our interactions to encompass your relationships with employees, business associates, and everyone you encounter in daily life." Joe paused, considering the full implications of this commitment. Changing how he interacted with Elena was one thing. Transforming his entire approach to human relationships was something else entirely. "That's a complete restructuring of how I operate in the world," Joe said slowly. "Yes, it is," Elena confirmed. "Which is why most people choose not to undertake genuine transformation. It's easier to make superficial adjustments than to examine fundamental assumptions about yourself and others." Joe looked around the dining room at the faces watching him, Thomas with concern, Isabella with journalistic fascination, other diners with curiosity and skepticism. He thought about his sister Claire, about the disappointment she might feel if she could see what he'd become, about the opportunity Elena was offering to honor her memory through genuine change. "I accept your conditions," Joe said firmly. "All of them." Elena nodded slowly, recognizing that she'd just agreed to undertake a project that would challenge her own understanding of human transformation. "Then we'll start with something simple. Tomorrow, I want you to have one conversation with someone, anyone, where you ask about their life without relating it back to business, where you listen without calculating advantage, where you respond with curiosity rather than judgment." "One conversation," Joe repeated. "One conversation. And then we'll see if you're genuinely ready for the work that comes next." The commitment was made, witnessed by dozens of people who would remember this evening for years to come. What none of them could anticipate was how this simple agreement would ripple outward, affecting not just Joe's life, but the lives of everyone who encountered the man he was about to become. 3 months had passed since that transformative evening at Belmont Grand Restaurant, and the city had begun to notice changes that no one could have predicted. The financial district buzzed with whispered conversations about Joe Blackwood's unprecedented transformation, not just in business practices but in fundamental human interactions that were reshaping entire corporate cultures. Elena Martinez stood before the graduating class of Riverside Community College, her master's thesis defense having evolved into something far more significant than academic research. Her work on dignity preservation in service interactions had attracted national attention after word spread about her unlikely mentorship of one of the country's most powerful executives. "The most profound discovery in my research," Elena addressed the packed auditorium, wasn't about service dynamics or economic hierarchies. It was about the universal human capacity for transformation when we're willing to examine our own behavior honestly and commit to genuine change. In the front row sat Joe Blackwood, no longer the arrogant billionaire who had demanded recognition based on wealth rather than character. His presence at a community college graduation represented just one of many changes that had surprised everyone who knew him. He listened with the same focused attention he'd once reserved only for board meetings and profit projections. Beside him sat Thomas Crawford, whose relationship with Joe had evolved from purely transactional to genuinely collaborative. Their weekly meetings now included discussions about Thomas's historical fiction writing, his daughter's environmental activism, and his wife's expanding art therapy practice. The transformation hadn't just changed Joe, it had liberated everyone around him to show their complete selves, rather than carefully edited professional versions. "Change isn't comfortable," Elena continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had guided others through genuine transformation. "It requires abandoning familiar patterns, questioning assumptions we've held for years, and accepting that growth often means admitting we were wrong about fundamental aspects of ourselves and others." Isabella Thornton sat in the media section, her column about that evening at Belmont Grand having sparked conversations across the country about wealth, privilege, and the possibility of redemption. What had begun as society gossip had evolved into a serious examination of how economic disparity affects human relationships and whether genuine change was possible for those corrupted by excessive power. Elena's research had documented not just Joe's transformation, but the ripple effects that had spread throughout his business empire and beyond. Employees at Blackwood Technologies reported unprecedented levels of job satisfaction as their CEO began treating them as complete human beings rather than production units. Turnover had dropped to nearly zero, productivity had increased dramatically, and the company had become a model for ethical business practices. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to help him become someone his late sister would have been proud to know," Elena shared with the audience. "But what we discovered together was that transformation isn't about becoming someone different. It's about removing the barriers that prevent us from being who we truly are." Joe felt tears forming as Elena spoke about his sister Claire. The guilt that had driven him to workaholism and emotional isolation had gradually transformed into motivation for honoring her memory through daily choices about how to treat others. He'd established the Claire Blackwood Foundation for Educational Access, funding scholarships and mentorship programs that connected successful professionals with students from disadvantaged backgrounds. But the foundation was just the visible symbol of deeper changes. Joe had learned to remember his employees' children's names, to ask about their dreams and challenges, to listen without calculating how their responses might benefit his business objectives. He discovered that genuine interest in others' well-being created loyalty and enthusiasm that no financial incentive could purchase. "The night we met," Elena continued, looking directly at Joe with a smile that conveyed both pride and affection. "Mr. Blackwood asked me what I saw when I looked at him. I told him I saw someone who had forgotten that money couldn't buy the things that mattered most. Today, when I look at him, I see someone who remembers." The audience erupted in sustained applause, recognizing that they were witnessing not just an academic presentation, but a testament to the possibility of profound personal transformation. Students, faculty, and community members had been following Elena's story through Isabella's columns and social media coverage, understanding that this represented hope for change in their own relationships and communities. Joe stood as Elena concluded her presentation, his applause joining hundreds of others who had been inspired by her research and their collaborative journey toward authentic human connection. When the applause finally subsided, he approached the podium with Elena's permission. "Elena asked me to become someone my sister would have been proud to know." Joe addressed the audience, his voice carrying across the auditorium with quiet authority. "But she taught me something even more important. That the person Claire would have been proudest to see wasn't someone I needed to become, but someone I had always been beneath the fear, arrogance, and emotional barriers I'd constructed." He paused, looking out at faces that represented every economic background, every educational level, every walk of life. 3 months ago, I measured success by how much I could accumulate, how many people feared my displeasure, how completely I could control my environment. Elena showed me that real success is measured by how much you contribute to others' well-being, how many people trust your integrity, how genuinely you can connect with the humanity in everyone you encounter. Joe turned to Elena, who stood beside him with the quiet dignity that had first challenged his assumptions about worth and value. Elena, you didn't just help me change my behavior. You helped me remember who I was before success taught me to value dominance over connection, before wealth convinced me that other people's opinions didn't matter, before fear made me forget that vulnerability is strength, not weakness. The audience listened in complete silence, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the conclusion of Elena's academic research, but the real-time demonstration of its practical application. Today, Elena graduates with her master's degree in social work, Joe continued. Tomorrow, she begins her doctoral program, fully funded by the Claire Blackwood Foundation, to expand her research on dignity preservation and human transformation. But more importantly, she continues the work she's always done, helping people remember their own worth and recognize the worth of others. Elena stepped forward, accepting the recognition with the same grace she'd shown throughout their journey together. The most important lesson we've learned is that transformation is contagious. When one person chooses to treat others with genuine dignity, it creates ripple effects that extend far beyond the original interaction. Every person in this auditorium has the power to start those ripples in their own relationships and communities. As the ceremony concluded and the audience began to disperse, Joe reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The man who had entered Belmont Grand Restaurant 3 months earlier, angry, isolated, measuring worth by wealth, felt like a stranger. Not because he'd become someone different, but because he'd finally removed the barriers that had hidden his authentic self. Elena approached him as the auditorium emptied, carrying the diploma that represented years of hard work and dedication. So, Mr. Blackwood, how does it feel to be someone your sister would be proud to know? Joe considered the question carefully, thinking about Claire's infectious laugh, her genuine curiosity about others, her ability to make everyone feel valued and heard. It feels like coming home to myself, he said finally. It feels like honoring her memory by living the values she tried to teach me, instead of just talking about them. And what's next? Elena asked. Next, we continue the work, Joe replied. We expand the foundation, support more students like you, create more opportunities for people to discover their own capacity for transformation. We prove that change isn't just possible, it's inevitable when people are willing to do the hard work of examining themselves honestly. Elena smiled, the same expression that had first shown Joe compassion when he deserved only criticism. Then let's get started. As they walked together toward the auditorium exit, Elena carrying her diploma and Joe carrying a sense of purpose he'd never experienced in all his years of business success, neither of them noticed Isabella Thornton in the back row, finishing her notes for the column that would inspire thousands of readers to examine their own capacity for transformation. The story that had begun with a moment of cruelty in an expensive restaurant had evolved into something far more powerful, proof that human dignity could triumph over economic disparity, that genuine change was possible for anyone willing to do the work, and that the ripple effects of one person's transformation could spread outward to touch countless lives. Joe Blackwood had learned that the things money couldn't buy, respect, connection, purpose, love, were the only things that truly mattered. And Elena Martinez had discovered that her academic research on dignity preservation could change the world, one conversation at a time. The evening that had started with a millionaire yelling at a waitress had become a testament to the transformative power of human dignity, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest choice to treat another person with respect.